Now, according to Chinese media, we're getting reports that Iran has sent 15,000 of its elite Revolutionary Guard troops to help maintain order in Syria. Now, let's discuss this further with Professor Syed Mohammed Morandi from the University of Tehran, joining us live now from Lebanon. Thank you for coming on RT today. Do you believe that Iran would risk getting involved in a conflict in another country, according to these reports from the Chinese media?
No, definitely not. Iran has no troops in the country. Iran has never had troops involved in the problems within Syria. This is basically Western propaganda, and someone in the Chinese media has been receiving information that is completely false. In general, the information that is produced in Syria and in the mainstream Western media comes from sources that are highly questionable, such as the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is based in London. And it just, for example, the other day claimed that in Syria, babies in incubators in hospitals were killed, were murdered by the government. And this is the second time they've produced such propaganda. And it reminds of one of what the Western media did before the war in Iraq.
Professor, if I may just jump in for a moment, I do apologize for interrupting, but you bring in the issue of propaganda here, that these reports, allegedly from the Chinese media, say that Iran has sent in upwards of 20,000 Revolutionary Guards into Syria. But you say it's propaganda, but many believe that the U.S. wants a regime change in Syria to weaken Iran. So, I mean, it's quite possible to imagine that Iran must be interested in the survival of Assad's regime.
Well, definitely Iran does support the Syrian government, and it supports reforms in the Syrian political order. According to polls carried out by the BBC, funded by the Qataris, the majority of Syrians back the Syrian president. They want him to remain in power. Even their own polls say that. On the other hand, Iran is completely opposed to foreign countries imposing their will on the Syrian people. We already see the Turks helping create civil war. We see the dictatorships in the Persian Gulf region funding civil war and violence in the country. It is these countries that should be blamed for much of the bloodshed in the country, and the West, of course, supports them as well. But the Western propaganda machine inverts reality in what if they are so keen on democracy in the region, the United States and its allies should call on all Arab dictatorships to their leaders to step aside and to have elections, such as in Saudi Arabia, such as in Bahrain.
As you say, though, that President Ahmadinejad, he does support the Assad regime ongoing in Syria, facing this pressure from the opposition. But Iran is now under severe international pressure over its nuclear program. We've seen the West bearing down on it even further in recent months. Do you think with Iran's support of the Syrian government, could Tehran really risk coming under even greater backlash if it in some way does support the Assad regime?
Well, remember, Iran's position is based upon a moral principle, and that is non-interference of hegemonic powers and the non-interference of neighboring countries in the Syrian internal affairs. The Syrian people have to make their own decisions, and they don't need to be funded. There doesn't need to be any funding for weapons coming outside the country. Even in Iraq, before the United States invaded Iraq and killed almost 1 million people, directly or indirectly as a result, the Iranians opposed that war as well, despite the fact that the Iranians had immense dislike for Saddam Hussein. They despised Saddam Hussein, and Iran supported the opposition in Iraq. But Iran was opposed to the war because it was unprincipled and against international law. In this case as well, the actions of the Turks and the dictatorships in the Persian Gulf region, along with the Western regimes, are against international law, and that is why Iran opposes these actions based upon the same moral principle.
Professor Syed Mohammed Morandi from the University of Tehran, live in Beirut. Thank you for joining us on RT today.